Hours earlier, those same hands had touched her like she was precious under the sapphire glow of his office. His fingers had moved gently through her curls. His skin had been warm, vibrant, and full of life. Now those hands were cold, bloody, trembling weakly in hers as he tried to reach out. The violent contrast tore a silent cry from her throat. "Hyun-Suk," she whispered, her voice cracking as she moved to the side of the bed. "Tasha," he mumbled weakly, his bloody hand reaching out, his fingers trembling as he tried to find her. I tried to stay out of it. I tried." "Oh my God," Tasha gasped, but her training overrode her shock. She immediately slapped her hands over his shoulder wound, applying all of her body weight to stop the spurting blood. "Get me 2 large-bore IVs. Prep a central line. We need O-negative blood now. Hook him up to the monitor." "He was ambushed in the alley, Tasha," Jae-Seung said, his voice shaking as he stood by the door, his hands slick with his best friend's blood. "They were remnants from Busan. They came for him." Tasha looked up at Jae-Seung, her eyes wide with a mixture of raw terror and a sudden burning anger. "You brought this here? To my hospital? To her wedding? You promised he was safe." "It wasn't his fault, Tasha," Jae-Seung tried to explain, his face etched with guilt. "Get out!" Tasha screamed, her voice echoing through the sterile, tiled bay, shocking the other nurses. "Get out of my trauma room, Jae-Seung! Let me save his life! Just get out!" Jae-Seung stepped back, his chest heaving, and slowly slipped out into the waiting room. Tasha turned her full attention back to Hyun-Suk. She leaned down, her face inches from his, her tears finally spilling over her surgical mask and dripping onto his cold cheek. "Look at me, Kim Hyun-Suk," she commanded, her voice fierce but trembling with absolute terror. "Do you hear me? Look at me. You do not get to die on my table. You do not get to leave me like this." "Tasha," he whispered, his eyes fluttering, his gaze struggling to focus on her face. I didn't want this life. Not anymore." "Then stay alive and prove it," she sobbed, pressing down harder on his shoulder as the blood seeped through her gloves. "You lied to me. You told me you wanted out. You told me you were clean. And now you're bleeding out because of some stupid Mafia garbage. Doctor, we're losing him. His pressure is 70/40 and dropping. He's going into shock," a resident shouted, rushing in with the intubation tray. "Push the blood," Tasha ordered, her vision completely blurring with tears. "Hyun-Suk, please, stay with me. Please don't leave me." As the medical team swarmed the bed, pushing drugs and preparing to intubate, Tasha was forced to step back. She stood against the cold tile wall, her hands covered in his warm blood, watching the man she loved fight for his life, paralyzed by the terrifying realization of how much she actually cared. 3 hours later, the storm outside had settled into a quiet, miserable drizzle that hung over the city like a shroud. The surgical light in the ICU hallway was dim and quiet. Hyun-Suk was finally out of surgery. The bullet had been successfully removed, the arterial bleeding stopped, and his shoulder reconstructed. He was heavily sedated, a ventilator tube helping him breathe, his chest rising and falling in a rhythmic mechanical pattern. Tasha stood by his bedside, having washed the blood from her hands, though her emerald green dress was ruined, partially covered by a disposable blue hospital gown. She stared down at his pale, peaceful face, her expression a painful mix of profound relief and deep, aching resentment. The heavy glass door slid open quietly. Jae-Seung and Aaliyah stepped in. Aaliyah's eyes were red and swollen from crying, and she immediately rushed to Tasha, throwing her arms around her best friend's neck. "Is he going to be okay?" Aaliyah whispered, her voice muffled against Tasha's shoulder. "The surgery went well," Tasha said, her voice hollow and empty, completely devoid of its usual warmth. "He's stable. He'll survive." But he was incredibly lucky, Aaliyah. A few centimeters to the left, and the bullet would have hit his subclavian artery. He would have bled out in that alley before Jae-Seung even found him. Aaliyah pulled back, looking at her brother, then back at Tasha. "Thank you, Tash. Thank you for saving his life." "Don't thank me," Tasha said, her eyes turning cold as she looked past Aaliyah to Jae-Seung. You need to take your brother and your husband and your legitimate business and get out of my sight. The violence follows you, and now it's in my hospital. It's in my life. Tasha, please, Jae-Seung said, stepping forward, his face etched with exhaustion and regret. You think Hyun-Suk wanted this? He's been working 18-hour days to make sure Lapis Blue L.A. is entirely clean. No shady deals, no syndicates. The men who did this, they were ghosts from the old Kim faction. They blamed him for surviving. It wasn't a transaction. It was pure, senseless revenge. Tasha stared at Jae-Seung, her jaw tight, her hands clenched into fists inside her gown. It doesn't matter, Jae. Don't you get it? It doesn't matter if he's the victim or the aggressor. The violence follows him. It follows all of you. And now it's in my hospital. It's in my life. Tasha, Aaliyah pleaded, her voice breaking. He loves you. He told me yesterday. No, Aaliyah, Tasha said, her voice cracking as a fresh wave of tears fell down her face. I spent last night in his arms. I let myself believe just for a second that maybe he was different, that maybe I could let my guard down and be happy. And then today I had to pump his chest and wash his blood off my skin. I can't do this. I won't do this. Suddenly, a weak, raspy cough came from the hospital bed. The ventilator had been dialed down by the respiratory therapist minutes earlier, and Hyun-Suk's eyes were open, squinting painfully against the harsh fluorescent lights. He looked at Tasha, his hand twitching weakly on the bedsheet as he tried to reach her. Tasha, he mumbled through the oxygen mask, his voice barely a whisper. Tasha looked at him, her heart breaking all over again. She wanted to run to him, to hold his hand and tell him everything would be okay. But the fear, the deep protective instinct that had kept her alive for years, pulled her back. You're awake, she said, her voice flat and distant. The doctor will be in to check on your vitals soon. Listen to Jae, Hyun-Suk whispered, his dark eyes pleading with her to believe him. I didn't choose this. I swear. It doesn't matter what you chose, Hyun-Suk, Tasha said, her tears finally spilling over her cheeks. The result is exactly the same. You bleed and I have to watch. She turned away from him, looking at Jae-Seung and Aaliyah. Take care of him. I'm going home. Tasha, wait! Aaliyah cried, but Tasha was already out the glass door, her hurried footsteps echoing down the quiet, sterile ICU corridor until they faded completely. Jae-Seung walked over to the bedside, placing a heavy, supportive hand on Hyun-Suk's uninjured shoulder. Get some rest, brother, Jae-Seung said, his voice turning deadly, chillingly cold as he stared out the window into the dark, rainy LA night. I'm going to find out exactly who brought Busan to our doorstep, and I'm going to make sure they never, ever go back. Hyun-Suk closed his eyes, a single, silent tear escaping down his temple and soaking into his pillow. He had survived the shooting, but as he listened to the steady, lonely beep of his heart monitor, he realized the true cost of his survival. Busan had taken his youth, his father, and his blood. And now, it had taken the only woman who made him want to live a clean life. The rain hadn't stopped by morning. Los Angeles wore storms badly. In Busan, the rain had always felt alive, violent, emotional, cleansing, bringing with it the wild ocean mist and the scent of the docks. But here, the Southern California downpour just made the city look exhausted. The slick, concrete-heavy landscape struggled to drain, leaving dirty puddles on the boulevards. Water streaked down the massive, tinted windows of the ICU in uneven rivers, distorting the bright red brake lights of the morning traffic crawling through the streets below. Hyun-Suk stared at the blurred lights from his hospital bed. He lay exceptionally still, the tight surgical dressings wrapping his shoulder acting like a heavy, physical anchor. He hadn't slept, not even for an hour. Every time his eyelids grew heavy and his vision darkened, the memory of yesterday flashed behind his eyes. He saw Tasha walking away from him down the sterile ICU corridor, her posture rigid, her shoulders tense with a heavy, unspoken sorrow. He saw her leaving him over and over again. The steady, repetitive beep of the cardiac monitor beside him filled the quiet room, sounding less like a medical reassurance and more like a rhythmic, mechanical punishment for the life he had tried so hard to escape. The heavy sliding glass door of the ICU room opened with a soft, pneumatic sigh. Jae-Seung stepped inside, bringing with him the sharp, rich scent of fresh coffee. He carried 2 paper cups in a cardboard tray, still wearing the damp, wrinkled jeans from the night before, his dark hair messy from the storm. A heavy shadow of stubble lined his jaw, and deep circles of exhaustion framed his eyes. "You look terrible," Jae-Seung muttered, his voice quiet as he closed the sliding door behind him. Hyun-Suk gave a weak, raspy scoff, the movement stretching the fresh stitches in his shoulder and causing him to wince. "I got shot twice, Lee. Forgive me if I didn't have time to shave." "Still, you look worse than expected." Jae-Seung set the coffee carrier down on the plastic bedside table, the steam rising weakly into the sterile, cool air of the room. "Thank you for the encouragement," Hyun-Suk sighed, slowly shifting his weight. "I'll try to color my cheeks for the nurses." Jae-Seung carefully handed him one of the warm cups, ensuring he didn't have to reach with his injured left side before pulling a heavy plastic chair closer to the bed. He sat down, leaning his elbows on his knees, his shoulders slumped under the weight of the last 24 hours. For a long, heavy moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt ancient. It was the kind of wordless understanding built over years of surviving the worst alleyways of Busan together, a quiet shorthand that didn't require explanations. Finally, Hyun-Suk's gaze drifted back to the rain-streaked window. He broke the silence, his voice hollow. "She hates me." Jae-Seung leaned back slowly, his eyes fixed on the steam curling from his cup. "No, she doesn't." "She should," Hyun-Suk replied, his jaw tightening as he looked down at the plastic IV port taped to his skin. "I brought this to her door, Jae. I brought the blood, the guns, the mess, everything she has spent her entire professional life trying to shut out." "No," Jae-Seung said, his voice flat, firm, and leaving no room for argument. "Busan brought this to her. The past brought this to her. You were just the target. That's the same thing." "The hell it is," Jae-Seung countered, his eyes flashing with a brief, fierce spark of the old Syndicate soldier. "You didn't ask for those thugs to show up in the alley. You were trying to run a legitimate business." Hyun-Suk's jaw clenched, his knuckles turning white where his hand gripped the hospital sheet. "You didn't see her face last night, Jae. You didn't look into her eyes when she was standing over me." "I did see her face," Jae-Seung said quietly. "She looked at me like I proved every single fear she ever had about men like us," Hyun-Suk whispered, the admission tearing at him more than the physical pain of his wounds. "She looked at me and saw a monster." Jae-Seung rubbed a tired hand over his face, letting out a long, slow breath before answering. "You know what I saw when I looked at her in that trauma bay?" "What?" "I saw a woman absolutely losing her mind because she thought you were dying on her table," Jae-Seung said, his voice dropping to a low, intense register. "She wasn't angry because she hated you, Hyun-Suk. She was terrified because she cared." Hyun-Suk turned his head away, staring back out at the gray, rain-smeared skyline of Los Angeles. The towering buildings looked like cold concrete monoliths in the storm. "That doesn't change anything," Hyun-Suk said quietly. "It changes everything." "No," Hyun-Suk said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the room's ventilation system. "Love doesn't erase fear, Jae. It just makes the danger feel more expensive." The words settled heavily in the small room, casting a somber shadow over both men. Jae-Seung studied his brother-in-law for a long, silent moment, recognizing the deep emotional bruising that surgery couldn't fix. "You love her?" Jae-Seung asked gently. Hyun-Suk let out a single bitter laugh under his breath, shaking his head slightly. "Is it that obvious? To me?" "Yeah," Jae-Seung said, a small, sad smile touching the corner of his mouth. "I've seen that look before. I wore it for a long time when Aaliyah was running from me." Another heavy silence descended on the room, punctuated only by the rhythmic beep, beep of the monitor. Then Hyun-Suk closed his eyes, his voice losing all of its defensive armor. "She makes me feel normal, Jae." Jae-Sung's expression shifted, his brow furrowing slightly as he listened. "That bad, huh?" "You don't understand," Hyun-Suk said, his chest rising and falling in a shallow breath. "I probably do," Jae-Sung murmured. "No," Hyun-Suk insisted, opening his eyes to look directly at his friend. "When I'm around her, my head gets quiet. For the first time in my life, the noise stops." Jae-Sung didn't interrupt, allowing the quiet confession to breathe. "That never happens for me," Hyun-Suk continued, his voice tight. "Not since the streets of Busan. Not since my father died and left us with his debts. Not since the faction wars. I've spent my entire life looking over my shoulder, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for the blade in the dark." He paused, swallowed hard. "With her, I stop waiting for violence." Jae-Sung exhaled slowly, setting his coffee cup down on the table. "That's dangerous, brother. In our world, a quiet head gets you killed." "I know," Hyun-Suk whispered. The glass door slid open once more before either man could speak further. Aaliyah walked in, carrying a small black garment bag zipped up to the top. She looked pale, her dark hair pulled back into a hasty, practical bun, but her eyes were sharp as she immediately scanned the room and frowned at the two of them. "Why do you both look like depressed Mafia widows?" she asked, trying to inject a bit of lightness into the heavy room as she hung the garment bag on the wall hook. Jae-Sung blinked, a weary smirk appearing on his face. "That's incredibly specific, Leah." "You haven't slept, Jae," she said, walking over to press a soft kiss to her husband's cheek. "And you look like you're planning a funeral." "Neither have you," Jae-Sung countered, wrapping his arm around her waist for a brief, comforting second. Aaliyah ignored his comment completely, turning her focus entirely to Hyun-Suk as she approached the bedside. She reached out, her fingers gently brushing the hair away from his forehead. "How's your pain?" she asked, her voice softening with genuine sisterly concern. "Tolerable," Hyun-Suk said, his tough facade slipping back into place. "That means terrible," Aaliyah corrected, her eyes scanning the dark bruises beginning to form around his collarbone. "I've had worse," he muttered. "Oppa." "I'm serious, Aaliyah. It's fine." Aaliyah's face softened instantly, the defensive, teasing mask she had worn when she walked in completely crumbling. Her eyes filled with sudden, bright tears. "You almost died yesterday," she whispered, her voice cracking slightly on the last word. Hyun-Suk looked down at the white cotton blanket, unable to meet her gaze. "Didn't." "That isn't the point." Aaliyah's voice was thick with emotion. Hyun-Suk immediately reached out with his uninjured hand, catching her trembling fingers despite the sharp pull of pain in his stitches. He squeezed her hand firmly. "Hey," he said softly, his voice warm. "Look at me. I'm right here." Aaliyah looked away quickly, blinking hard to keep the tears from falling, her throat tight. "You scared me, Oppa. You really scared me." "I know. You promised me we were done with this life," she said, her voice dropping to a vulnerable whisper. "You promised me Lapis Blue L.A. was going to be clean. No more blood." "I am done," Hyun-Suk said, his dark eyes fierce with sincerity. "I swear to you, Aaliyah, I want nothing to do with that world." "Then why does it keep finding us?" she asked, looking between her brother and her husband. No one answered her, because in the quiet, sterile room, under the steady rain hammering against the glass, no one had an answer. The room fell quiet again, the heavy reality of their situation settling back over them like a cold fog. Finally, Jae-Sung stood up, his leather jacket creaking as he stretched his stiff muscles. "I need to go make some calls," Jae-Sung said, his voice shifting back into a businesslike, hard tone. Hyun-Suk's eyes lifted immediately, his gaze narrowing as he watched his friend. "What calls, Jae?" "The kind that involves finding 3 idiots from Busan who think they can bring their garbage to my city," Jae-Sung said flatly, his jaw tight. "No," Hyun-Suk said, his voice transitionally hard. Jae-Seung looked down at him, his expression completely unreadable. "They tried to kill you, Hyun-Suk. They shot you in broad daylight behind our club. And if you retaliate, this escalates," Hyun-Suk reasoning, his voice rising slightly despite his physical weakness. "The moment you strike back, the Park family remnants will think we're starting a war. They'll send more men." "It already escalated the second they pulled a trigger in my alley," Jae-Seung countered, stepping closer to the bed. "I'm serious, Jae. Let it go," Hyun-Suk insisted, his hand tightening on Aaliyah's. "So am I," Jae-Seung said, his voice dangerously low. Hyun-Suk's voice hardened, a sudden, powerful authority returning to his tone despite the pale color of his skin. "You promised Aaliyah we were building something different here, Lee. You promised her a real life, a family. And I also promised I'd protect my family by any means necessary," Jae-Seung said, his eyes cold. "And right now that means putting these dogs down before they can bite again. We don't even know who sent them." "We'll find out," Jae-Seung said. "No!" Hyun-Suk shouted. The sudden outburst echoed sharply through the quiet ICU room, the raw volume tearing through his throat. The cardiac monitor beside the bed spiked instantly, its slow, steady beep accelerating into a frantic, high-pitched alarm as his heart rate surged. Aaliyah flinched at the sound, her eyes wide with alarm. Hyun-Suk closed eyes immediately, his face twisting in physical agony as he breathed hard, his hand clutching his chest where the muscles of his shoulder had seized in a violent spasm. "I'm tired," he whispered, his voice suddenly sounding incredibly small, stripped of all its anger. "I'm just so tired." The frantic alarm of the monitor began to slow, gradually settling back into its rhythmic, dull hum as his breathing stabilized. Jae-Seung's anger dimmed instantly, replaced by a deep, aching guilt as he looked down at his battered brother-in-law. "I know," Jae-Seung said quietly. "No, you don't," Hyun-Suk said, opening his eyes slowly. For the first time since they had escaped the bloody ruins of the Kim faction in Busan, Jae-Seung saw something truly terrifying in his friend's eyes. It wasn't rage. It wasn't a desire for vengeance. It was exhaustion. A bone-deep, soul-crushing exhaustion that no amount of rest could cure. "I don't want to bury another body, Jae," Hyun-Suk said, his voice raw and pleading. "I don't want more blood on my hands. I don't want more retaliation. I don't want to spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder waiting for ghosts to show up at my door. I just want it to stop." Jae-Seung stared at him, the harsh words of retaliation dying in his throat. Slowly, he sat back down in the plastic chair, his head dropping into his hands as the silence of the room returned. The rain outside hammered harder against the glass, a constant gray static that blurred the world beyond. Aaliyah looked between the two men, her heart breaking for both of them, before she spoke carefully, her voice barely a whisper. "What if this isn't over, Oppa? What if they don't care that we want peace?" Neither man answered her, because deep down in their bones, both of them already knew she was right. The neon hum of a cheap motel sign flickered outside a dingy window in Wilmington, casting erratic violet light over the vinyl floor. Inside, the air was thick with the copper stench of blood and cheap antiseptic. The two surviving Busan thugs were frantically stuffing cash into a leather duffel bag. The injured leader, Min Ho, sat groaning on the edge of a stained mattress, holding a wet towel to his shattered jaw. The door didn't open. It exploded inward, the frame splintering with a deafening crack. Before they could reach for their weapons, Jae-Seung stepped through the dust. His custom-tailored suit was gone, replaced by a dark leather jacket, his eyes empty of any warmth. Behind him stood 3 massive local security enforcers he had hired from the L.A. docks, their silhouettes blocking the light. "Who told you that you could bleed on my streets?" Jae-Seung's voice was dangerously quiet, cutting through the low whine of the wind outside. "Lee Jae-Seung!" One of the standing thugs gasped in Korean, his hand twitching toward his waistband. Jae-Seung didn't hesitate. He closed the distance in a fraction of a second, driving his heel into the thug's knee. A sickening pop echoed through the room, followed by a scream as the man collapsed. Jae-Seung calmly caught the thug's falling gun mid-air, spinning it around to press the cold steel directly against Minho's temple. "Don't move," Jae-Seung whispered in Korean, "unless you want the rest of your brains to match your jaw." Minho raised his hands slowly, his eyes wide with a terror he hadn't felt since the collapse of the Kim faction. We were just following orders. There are others coming, Lee. You can't kill us all." "Who sent you?" Jae-Seung pressed the barrel harder, his knuckle turning white on the trigger. "Give me a name or this motel room gets a new coat of paint." "Park's nephew, Dong-woo," Minho choked out, spit and blood leaking from his mouth. "He wants the Lapis Blue Empire. He said if we took out Hyun-Suk, the American expansion would fall apart. He's at the harbor container terminal tonight, waiting for our call." Jae-Seung stared at him, his expression completely unreadable. Slowly, he pulled the gun back, throwing it to one of his hired men. "Tie them up," Jae-Seung commanded. "If they make a sound, bury them under the freeway." "Jae-Seung!" Minho cried out as he was shoved onto the floor. "You're a legitimate businessman now. You can't do this." "I am a legitimate businessman," Jae-Seung said, adjusting his collar as he walked toward the door. "But my brother is dying in a hospital up the road, and my wife is crying. That makes me very bad for business." Across the city, in a quiet, modest apartment in East Los Angeles, Tasha sat alone at her kitchen counter. She wore an oversized gray sweatshirt that swallowed her small frame, her knees pulled up to her chest as she stared blankly at a ceramic cup of coffee. The steam had stopped rising from it over an hour ago, leaving the dark liquid cold and undisturbed. She hadn't slept either. Every time she closed her eyes, the sterile, bright lights of the trauma bay flared in her mind. She saw the blood, so much of it, staining her hands, soaking through her sterile gloves, dripping onto her shoes. She saw Hyun-Suk's gray, ash-colored face, his dark eyes wild with pain and fear, reaching out for her with trembling fingers. She heard his voice, a broken whisper calling her name over the roar of the monitor alarms. The sudden harsh buzz of her phone vibrating against the marble counter made her flinch. She glanced down. Aaliyah. It was the 5th time her best friend had called since dawn. Tasha stared at the glowing screen for a long, agonizing second before reaching out and declining the call, pushing the phone away. She couldn't talk to Aaliyah. She couldn't listen to her apologize or plead or tell her that everything was going to be fine. 30 seconds later, the phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up the dim kitchen. Jae-Seung. Tasha closed her eyes and declined the call immediately, her jaw tightening. Then the quiet of the kitchen was broken by the sharp chirp of a text message. "Aaliyah. He keeps asking if you're okay." Tasha stared at the words, her chest tightening so painfully she could barely draw a breath. She gripped her mug of cold coffee, her knuckles turning white, wanting to throw the phone across the room. Another message appeared on the screen, the blue light reflecting in the dark surface of her cold drink. "Aaliyah. He hasn't asked about his own shoulder once, Tash. Just you." Tasha shut her eyes hard, a single hot tear escaping and rolling down her cheek. "Damn you," she whispered to the empty kitchen, her voice breaking. "Damn you, Kim." Because that was the real problem. If Hyun-Suk had been cruel, if he had been the arrogant, reckless gangster she had convinced herself he was, this would have been easy. She could have written him off as just another trauma statistic, another handsome, dangerous man who got what he deserved in the streets. She could have walked away and never looked back. But he wasn't. He was tired. He was wounded, vulnerable, and trying with every ounce of his soul to build a quiet life in a city that didn't know his name. He was trying to change. And somehow that made the terror of loving him 1,000 times worse. Her phone buzzed one final time, the vibration rattling against the cold counter. This time, the contact name on the screen made her breath catch in her throat. Hyun-Suk. Tasha froze completely, her hand hovering over the screen. The kitchen was entirely still, the only sound the soft patter of the rain against her window as the screen glowed silently in the dawn shadows. Hyun-Suk, I meant what I said last night. Tasha stared at the words, her heart hammering against her ribs. Another message came seconds later, the typing bubbles appearing and disappearing with agonizing hesitation. Hyun-Suk, I wanted out of that life. I still do. Tasha stared at the screen for a long, quiet minute, her eyes burning with unshed tears. Finally, her fingers trembling, she slowly typed her reply. Tasha, people like you never really get out, Hyun-Suk. The past doesn't let you. She hit send, her breath catching as the typing bubble on his end appeared almost instantly. It bubbled for a moment, stopped, started again, stopped again as if he were struggling to find the words to bridge the canyon between them. Finally, the message came through. Hyun-Suk, what if I'm trying anyway? Tasha's throat tightened unexpectedly, a soft sob escaping her lips. She stared at the simple, devastatingly honest words on the screen, her vision blurring. Because she didn't have an answer for that. And somewhere deep down, in the quietest, most vulnerable part of her heart, that terrified her far more than the shooting itself. By midnight, the harbor at the port of Los Angeles was desolate, shrouded in a heavy fog that rolled off the dark Pacific water. Rows of towering shipping containers stacked like multicolored monoliths cast long, distorted shadows across the wet concrete. Jae-Seung stood alone near container 408, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. The mist clung to his hair, turning it silver. From the shadow of a rusted crane, a tall, elegantly dressed Korean man stepped out, flanked by 4 armed bodyguards. Dong-woo, the ambitious nephew of the fallen Park Syndicate leader, smiled warmly, as if meeting an old friend for coffee. Lee Jae-Seung, Dong-woo spoke in fluent, mocking English. I must say I am impressed. I expected to hear from Min-ho tonight, but instead I get a text from your number. You always were the smartest dog in the Kim family. Min-ho is currently enjoying the hospitality of the LAPD, Jae-Seung lied smoothly, his voice completely level. They found him in a motel with a trunk full of unregistered firearms and blood on his shoes. He was very chatty. Dong-woo's smile stiffened, his eyes narrowing. You think you can scare me with American police? I have deep pockets, Lee. By tomorrow those men will be out, and Lapis Blue will still belong to us. You don't get it, do you? Jae-Seung took a slow step forward, his boot splashing in a puddle. You think this is Busan. You think you can pay off the right precinct, bury a few bodies in the harbor, and take over. But this is Los Angeles. The people who own this port don't look like us, and they don't care about your old syndicate beefs. They care about their money, and right now, you are making them very uncomfortable. Is that a threat? Dong-woo scoffed, gesturing to his armed guards. You came here alone, Lee. That was your first and last mistake. I didn't come alone, Jae-Seung said, pulling his hand from his pocket to reveal a small, blinking black device. I brought the Port Authority, the FBI, and the local harbor police. They've been tracking this container for 3 days because someone tipped them off about a massive shipment of counterfeit luxury goods inside. I believe the manifest has your name on it. Dong-woo. On cue, the blinding sweep of searchlights cut through the heavy fog from the water, accompanied by the deep, booming sirens of police boats. Red and blue lights began to crawl over the shipping containers from the land side, blocking every exit. You bastard! Dong-woo snarled, reaching for his weapon. If you shoot me, you die in a federal prison, Jae-Seung said, his voice rising just enough to be heard over the sirens. If you drop the guns, you get deported back to Busan, where the remnants of the Park family are waiting to ask why you lost their shipment. Your choice. For a long, agonizing second, the only sound was the wind rushing through the steel containers. Slowly, one by one, Dong-woo's guards dropped their weapons onto the wet concrete. Dong-woo stared at Jae-Seung, his face twisted in absolute hatred. This isn't over, Lee. We will find you. No, you won't, Jae-Seung said, turning his back on them as the first tactical team breached the perimeter. Because in this country, I am a ghost, and you are just a memory. The morning sun finally broke through the heavy gray clouds, painting the sky over East LA in soft hues of pink and gold. Inside the ICU, the light warmed the sterile room, casting a soft glow over the small bed. Tasha had fallen asleep in the plastic chair, her head resting on the edge of the mattress, her hand still tightly gripped in Hyun-Suk's. Hyun-Suk watched her breathe, his thumb gently tracing the back of her knuckles. The constant, frantic rhythm of his heart monitor had settled into a slow, peaceful hum. A soft knock on the glass door broke the silence. Aaliyah and Jae-Seung stepped in, both of them looking exhausted but carrying an undeniable sense of relief. Jae-Seung's face had a small cut near his temple, but his eyes were bright. Tasha stirred, blinking against the morning light, and quickly pulled her hand back, her professional instincts kicking in as she sat up straight. Did you get them?" Hyun-Suk asked, his voice stronger than it had been the night before. Jae-Seung walked to the side of the bed, looking down at his brother-in-law with a quiet, tired smile. "They're gone, Hyun-Suk. Deported or locked up. The port is clear. The LA expansion is safe." Aaliyah smiled, leaning her head against Jae-Seung's shoulder. "The wedding is still on for tomorrow, Oppa, if the best man is up for it." Hyun-Suk looked up at Tasha, a soft, rare smile touching his lips. "I think the best man might need some assistance walking down the aisle, if the maid of honor is willing to hold him up." Tasha looked at the three of them, the family that had fought through blood and oceans to stand in this quiet room. She looked at the ruined emerald dress draped over the chair, then back at Hyun-Suk's dark, hopeful eyes. "Don't get used to it, Kim," Tasha said, though her voice was thick with emotion as she reached out to adjust his blanket, her fingers lingering on his uninjured shoulder. "But I suppose I can keep you from falling. Just this once." "Just this once," Hyun-Suk echoed, his hand finding hers again under the morning sun. For the first time in 2 years, the ghosts of Busan felt very, very far away. And as the city of Los Angeles woke up below them, the future finally looked like something they could build together.